Welcome to Asia Pacific Defence Reporter, your go-to source for cutting-edge security insights in the region. Get ready for rapid-fire analysis and commentary from the Asia Pacific with your host, Kim Bergman.
Hello and welcome back. This podcast has quite a few different topics I'd like to cover with no particular theme. So I'll start with the deliberate mistake I made in the previous podcast when I said that the shipbuilding pulse for Hunter-class frigates was moving from 15 weeks to 10 weeks. That was completely wrong because it's days, not weeks. Now, my written report in the current edition of APDR has that right, but my verbal commentary got it wrong. I also mentioned that I'd written extensively about the Mogami frigate, and I also recognise that the whole reason for doing podcasts is that people don't always have a chance to read that and prefer listening to this while they're in their cars or going for a walk or whatever. So I'll just say that apart from doing my best to provide a technical description of the ship, which I described as a technological marvel, and indeed it is, arguably the most advanced warship in the world, certainly one of the most advanced warships in the world. But I concluded that none of the ships will ever be built in Australia. You might recall that the government's stated policy for the 11 frigates is that the first 3 will be built in Japan by Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, and then that process will magically transition to the Henderson Defence Precinct in WA, and that the balance of the frigates, that's the 8 remaining 6,500-ton highly complex ships, will be built here. Now, even my Japanese contacts are starting to agree that's never going to happen. And there are 2 very important reasons why that, unfortunately, will be the case. First of all is that Australia, or companies at the Henderson Precinct, simply do not have the skills necessary to build an advanced warship of the complexity of Mogami that requires not only metal bashing to occur, steel plate to be welded, but a huge amount of systems integration to occur with a lot of advanced electronics involved. The official line from the government is that Austal, their preferred partner, we still don't quite understand why there's this favouritism for Austal, but let's not go there in this episode. Austal is now under contract to build landing craft for the Army, medium landing craft of about 500 tons, and then much heavier landing craft for tanks and other armoured vehicles that will be about 4,000 tons, which is a pretty decent lump of metal. But lump of metal is the appropriate description, because these craft are basically just large barges. They have no combat systems, they have no weapons to speak of, perhaps a few heavy machine guns here and there, but that's it. The idea that you can somehow gain enough experience building barges to then allow you to smoothly transition to the construction of Mogami frigates, I think is just laughable. And I do have a bit of an industry background here, particularly on the shipbuilding side of things, so it's a little bit dated, but I nevertheless would like to think that I do have some idea of the complexity involved in building a modern warship, and the companies, regrettably, in Western Australia are simply not equipped for a task of that magnitude and complexity, and building some landing craft will not get them there. That's the first reason. The second one is commercial, and in what I still regard as an absolute shocking oversight in the travesty of the evaluation between the Mogami of the MECO 200 from TKMS. Defence did not ask either bidder for a single line in their responses about how they could transition the build from the parent yard In the case of TKMS, that obviously was in Germany, and in the case of Japan, as I say, it's MHI in Nagasaki. Not a single line about how they would move production to Australia, and even more importantly, neither of the bidders was required to provide any costings at all about the actual dollar cost of that transition. Now, the way is open when the government eventually asks MHI, or in fact, the contracting structure for Mogami is quite complex by Australian standards. It's a series of separate contracts with different Japanese firms, of which MHI is the leader in this. Anyway, when the government gets around to asking them for a quote, or gets Austal to ask them for a quote, my prediction is that Japanese companies will do a small amount of research, and they will conclude, quite understandably, that to build these ships in Australia is going to be 2 or 3 times greater than doing the work in Japan, and the whole deal will be off. Anyway, I'm not moving on. I note that New Zealand is also thinking about buying Mogami frigates. I think they're getting pretty close to a decision. I assume that if they do, they will follow the Australian methodology of having the ships built in Japan for them. I don't see any alternative to that strategy, particularly for a much smaller country like New Zealand. Now, what else? AUKUS, and I've seen further statements from Defence Minister Richard Marles answering questions from journalists that there's no need for a plan B, that AUKUS is still all fine, that there's no reason to worry. Now, I noticed some contradictory statements from the outgoing USN head of INDOPACOM, Admiral Sam Paparo, and I'll get to that in a moment. But I'd just like to start with a little bit of history. And I'd like to go back, for the purpose of this exercise, to the Crimean War, which lasted from October 1853 to March 1856. And the British commander, students of history might have heard of him, Lord Raglan. Now, he was born Fitzroy James Henry Somerset, but then became a peer. So he was commander of the British forces. The campaign was characterized by high losses due to a number of factors: disease, inadequate supplies, incompetence, including on the part of Lord Raglan. He was instrumental in the charge of the Light Brigade. We've all heard of that one. A military disaster, a complete fiasco, a demonstration of incompetence, and without analysing the whole thing, it went back to Lord Raglan issuing an ambiguous order about what to do. Now, the reason why I'm going through all of this is that one of the quirks of Lord Raglan is that he started off his life in the Napoleonic Wars and was an advisor to the Duke of Wellington, the hero of Waterloo and various other battles. And Lord Raglan was so used, so conditioned to fighting the French, that he stuck with that during the Crimean War and frequently referred to the Russian enemy as the French, even though in that conflict France was an ally of Britain and deployed to Crimea, but Lord Raglan was incapable of getting his head around the fact that the enemy were not the French, they were the Russians. Now, you see, this is what I find is what we're seeing with the AUKUS mindset, and more broadly, the attitude to the United States, that nothing has changed, that they're all going to be there forever, nothing going on at all, contrary to what we can see with our own eyes. And again, I know it's sort of pick on Richard Marles. I do tend to do that a lot, but I do see him as the source of a lot of the broader problems, foreign policy problems of the government in this regard, with his total refusal to accept that the world has changed. I think that this is a dangerous thing for a senior minister in charge of such an important portfolio to be thinking, to be having such a blind spot. And I'd say, imagine if at the outbreak of COVID, our health minister had been some sort of anti-vax COVID denier. It would have been outrageous that the person would have been removed. And yet we are, I believe, the globe, the Western world, because of the actions not just of the United States, China and Russia as well, but the principal disruptor for the last 16 months or however long Donald Trump has been president of the United States has been the US randomly throwing its weight around. Now, I just referenced Admiral retiring Sam Paparo, the head of INDOPACOM, who told Congress during an inquiry, this is about a fortnight ago, he was lamenting the inability of the US industrial base to build enough warships and enough supply ships. But he then said very specifically, and this is now the direct quote, "We certainly don't have enough attack submarines and our trajectory is on the wrong side." I'll repeat, we certainly don't have enough attack submarines and our trajectory is on the wrong side. Now, to me, that seems quite unambiguous. This very, very senior USN figure saying, look, we're struggling to produce enough SSNs for our own needs, and that trend is looking worse, not better. So let me put the Australian attitude, or rather the Australian government's attitude, in psychological terms. It's like being in a toxic relationship where Australian politicians and bureaucrats cannot objectively view what is taking place. And as I've mentioned previously, there's a small glimmer of hope, I thought, that the opposition will at least start to ask some questions about AUKUS, but I now wonder about that after the dynamics of the Farrer by-election. Now that if people haven't been watching this, One Nation have their first seat in the House of Reps. Will that push the coalition further to the right? Most people expect so. And if that flows through to defence and security policy, I suspect it will lead to promises of more money for defence, yet again, and offering even further inducements to the Trump administration, some sort of lavish gift, maybe Tasmania. Now, what else? The Iran standoff, of course, continues. Iran looks to be in no particular rush, and people surely by now have realised that Donald Trump repeatedly lies when he says that a deal is imminent. It's just not happening. And I'm loath to spend too much time on this because the situation changes every 24 hours or so. But at the time of recording this, Monday morning, Trump has just rejected Iran's latest response as totally unacceptable. And this follows, surprise, surprise, a phone call he had with Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, who is so obviously publicly salivating at the idea of bombing Iran some more, along with South Lebanon, and I have no doubt he would also like to resume bombing Gaza, except for the fact that there's nothing left to bomb. Now, maybe I can make a contribution with a few words about Iran's nuclear program, a loathsome regime that it is. I've been very clear about that, because I have seen some commentary erroneously claiming that Iran has now nuclear-grade bomb material. No, it doesn't. Whatever stockpile remains, said to be 440 kilos of enriched uranium, that's enriched to about 60%. To get to bomb grade, that's above 90% of uranium-235. And that's the sort of uranium, by the way, that powers Virginia-class submarines. Now, you can do it at 80%, but then you need a disproportionately large mass of uranium to achieve a critical mass and make it explode. Anyway, I can elaborate on that in the future if people are interested. And now I also wonder whether at some point there will be a break in US-Israel relations, because Donald Trump was talked into this war by Benjamin Netanyahu. Donald Trump appears to flip-flop, sometimes thinking that he can deal with Iran and at other times not, particularly after an intervention from Netanyahu. But if it all goes badly for the United States and Trump starts looking for scapegoats, then Benjamin Netanyahu will be on the top of that particular list. Now, another interesting feature of what's going on in the Middle East, and again, I'll relate this to Australia by saying I'm just about to say a few words about Saudi Arabia, which has a very close relationship with the United States, or rather, I should say, with the Trump administration. Now, some of this is commercial. Saudis gave son-in-law Jared Kushner $2 billion to invest on their behalf, an investment which, as far as I'm aware, has returned nothing in terms of profit. They buy a huge amount of military equipment. They've treated Trump when he visits like some sort of god emperor, putting his hands on some sort of glowing orb. I think that was Trump 1.0. Anyway, now the Saudis and the United States are having falling out. So listen to this, Australian Trump boosters, because Saudi Arabia just recently, like 3 days ago, denied the United States the use of critical military facilities when the US tried briefly to implement an activity called Project Freedom, where they were going to escort ships through the Straits of Hormuz. That lasted 36 hours with 2 ships being escorted. That was it. Now, the Saudis say they were not consulted, and the operation looked haphazard and ill-conceived. Well, gosh, well, what a surprise. This is what you get when you have a Secretary of War who has the emotional stability of a 6-year-old on red cordial, and which reflects the emotional stability of the president himself. And who, by the way, would not have helped matters by saying publicly that Saudi Arabia's ruler and journalist murderer, Mohammed bin Salman, had to kiss Trump's backside. Well, I bet that went over so well in the royal palace. Anyway, so the Saudis have had a falling out. The Saudis have also had a falling out with the UAE. As I say, Israel and the US could be heading for falling out as well. Anyway, so what else is coming up? Oh, well, Trump's visit to Beijing next week, and a lot of North Asia is on edge. Taiwan is concerned that it's going to be a casualty with reduced US arms sales to it, or possibly worse, like a cessation altogether of arms supplies, or on top of that, some sort of sellout regarding the status quo where stability across the Taiwan Straits is maintained. And again, the problem with President Trump that we have seen time and time again, except in the eyes of Australian politicians, is that he doesn't read briefing papers. He doesn't listen to what officials are saying to him. He just relies on his gut. He just believes in his own genius, his own power of persuasion, that he can go into a meeting with China's President Xi and persuade him to do whatever, when the likelihood is it's going to go the other way. So we'll be watching that one very closely. At the same time, relations between Japan and China are at an all-time low, and that's really saying something. And this is also for complex reasons, but including the US Undersecretary for Defence Elbridge Colby, well known to some Australians as the person who headed their AUKUS review, pressed Japan for some sort of public commitment for support to Taiwan. New Prime Minister Sayana Takaichi did exactly that, with Japan saying words to the effect that such an invasion of Taiwan would be an existential crisis for Japan and would require an appropriate response. Beijing went into meltdown, and then the US pressured Japan into backing down. The South Koreans are also keeping their heads down, just hoping that nothing goes wrong, because while South Korea can well and truly defend itself in any conventional conflict, the North has nuclear weapons and they do not. Trump is swinging a huge wrecking ball through the Middle East, Europe, and North Asia, and no one can be certain of what the outcome will be, except, of course, for our government insisting everything is fine. Or more precisely, there is an acknowledgement that the world is a more dangerous place, but stubbornly refused to examine the causes. I mean, surely it must be the fault of China or Russia or North Korea, or basically the fault of anyone other than the US. I'm sorry this has been a little bit repetitive, but this is the world that we live in, And I'm certainly going to be watching how the summit between Trump and Xi goes and how the situation plays out in the Middle East. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye for now, and see you next time.
That's today's Asia-Pacific Defence Reporter. For more in-depth articles, expert opinions and exclusive interviews, visit AsiaPacificDefenceReporter.com. Stay informed, stay ahead. This is your source for all things defence. Until next time.